Well, thank you very much. As Minister Steinmeier has to head to Minsk, as he mentioned, and we really have to finish our discussion at 10:15. And we have a lot of topics, a lot of crises, a lot of questions, your questions as well, that we try to include anyway. We will start right away and try to make our way through an interesting and challenging world. Minister Steinmeier, you recently said that a unified Europe can be a magnet, but that member countries by themselves are no much more than iron fillings in a new world. What do you think? The wake-up calls, talking about Brexit, talking about the election in the United States, what will be the result? More forces around the magnetic field or more centrifugal forces?
Also erstens muss ich sagen, dieses Bild vom
First of all, this magnet and the iron spans, I actually stole that as the Robert Musil, and the Austrians are looking at me already very critically, but okay, it's a strong picture, and that's why I thought it was good, and it actually describes the challenge of the current situation of European politicians. So when you feel as a European, then you have to do everything that this Europe remains a magnet. In truth, Europe is a magnet for the metal splints, and there's so many people coming to Europe. And sometimes we're even overtaxed by that. So the second point is that I don't see the necessary degree of responsibility in many people to maintain this strong Europe. And that's a reason why I just said at the rostrum, from my point of view, there's only one way. So this Europe we cannot just wish Europe to be healthy, and we cannot only hold speeches talking about our common values and confirm them, and that's been done sufficiently. No. People are as they will be. They expect from their national governments that they give answers, and they expect from a European leadership that they provide answers. That's why I think what damaged Europe, that in many areas we either had wrong compromises or no solutions at all. So the migration issue Paul just talked about is an example for this. This is a debate that shook Europe and changed majorities in Europe. And in Europe, we were not able to deliver common answers. So then, guaranteeing a European security policy, we have to give the answers. And as our two speeches have shown, we've taken a step forward in European security policy. At least it's on the right path. And the third issue is open. And that's in the Mediterranean countries. It's been discussed more than here in Germany. But when Paolo Gentiloni speaks of a lack of growth, then he speaks of unemployment, and especially youth unemployment, and how we can stimulate growth newly in Europe. And that is a discussion we still have ahead of us.
Both in your speeches agreed that Europe has to deliver concrete solutions to really embrace people in these crucial times again. In this context, you had been in recent articles lobbying and calling for a kind of Schengen of defense, a defense Schengen. So do you think security and maybe a joint effort in this area could be one of those strong responses that could really reach people? Or is it, to put it that way, more a new and maybe even desperate attempt because growth is not starting so far and the traditional answers are not sufficient for a lot of people?
Well, we don't have a single decisive answer, unfortunately, but for sure, in the group of crucial answer, this idea of relaunching the common defense is interesting. You know you all know that we are talking of common defense since maybe 20 years. But something new is happening. Why? Because the fact that UK is considering itself as a country leaving EU in the next few years is changing their attitude towards European common defense, obviously. What we are presuming, because we have no real clarity, but what we are presuming of a possible reduced involvement from US is also pushing in this direction. And there is now a very good level of cooperation on the subject between Germany, Italy, France, and Spain. Will it last, this very good level of cooperation? Well, it depends on internal evolution in these 3 or 4 countries. We are not sure. But for the time being, I think that we have 2 goals that are possible for us. One is already there, and we made progress in the last 10 days at a 27, 28 level to have more common defense in place. We will also deliver on a European fund for common defense, for industry of the defense in the next European Council. The other step that we can do, I think we can try to implement, is to use the treaties where they authorize forms of structured permanent cooperation among certain countries on the field of defense. And this could be done by 4, 5, 6, a certain number of countries. This is why we use this image of Schengen of defense.
Just to catch up with that and briefly play the ball to Frank-Walter Steinmeier, that means on a broader scale that Europe, having been founded as a project of peace, could achieve a new dynamic, political dynamic, as out from this common joint security effort. Are you agreeing on that? I mean,
So now I don't agree that the obligation of common European security policy is only the consequence of a Brexit decision and the desperation spreading in Europe. For me, as a foreign policy maker, it's also a perception that the security situation has changed dramatically in Europe. So the Ukraine conflict, for instance, has brought the question of peace and war into a continent where we thought that had been resolved forever. Now we see that this has not been resolved forever, this question of war and peace. We're trying to resolve this conflict, at least not have a further escalation of this conflict. But that's the one side. The other side is that in this changed security situation, we have to do more for our own security. And that's why I always say in my public speeches that, okay, we look also to the USA. That is a matter of fact. That with our possibility, we're trying to establish what direction a new American foreign policy is going to take. That is necessary. The transatlantic relationship is the foundation of the West. We need to promote this foundation from both sides and maintain this foundation, and we will do that. And we hope that the American side will have a same and similar attitude and work towards this goal. However, at this point in time, we are still trying to find the right partners for discussions and negotiations. That's why I cannot give you any final position on that today. Still, with all the insecurity, I don't share one position that we've heard the past days and described in the newspapers, that the greatest insecurity about the American defense policy and military policy. So I don't know whether I'm right, but so when I look at the American structures, there is a very solid block, and that is the American security community. So this is the Pentagon, it's the accompanying think tanks, and then there's also part of the intelligence community. So that's such a solid block. I don't think that any future American president is going to be able to avoid that. But what is much more open, and we're going to have much more exchange there, is the future American foreign policy. So in other words, in a nutshell, I don't believe that the United States will withdraw from NATO, as some fear. It's going to be a trend that the Americans will expect more from Europe, but I don't believe that they're going to withdraw from from NATO. So with regard to their foreign policy, for me, or for us, so we discussed that yesterday evening, it's still very open where a future American government is going to focus on. Okay, so regardless of the American elections, Europe has to do more for its own security.
Values, just to catch up. Mr. Gentiloni, I mean, Nigel Farage, the Brexit initiator, feels drawn to the US apparently right now. Steve Bannon is now the chief strategist of Trump. And his main platform, Breitbart.com, openly is pushing to Germany, to France, and apparently to Italy as well. And this before the upcoming election. So do you see the risk that there might be a new project, transatlantic project, and no more the liberal democratic project, but maybe a kind of joint link between anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and partially populist and racial transatlantic bound? Do you see that risk?
Well, it's difficult. It's always difficult to, in principle, to tell that there is no risk. But to be blunt, my impression is that the changement of the attitudes of some 100,000 of American voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania did not change the United States. So the United States is a strong democratic country with several powers. Frank Walter was now mentioning the differences that are there. We will see what the, it's too early to say what the approach will be. But just to make an example, the relation between US and Russia. We were the one, Frank Walter and me, I'm not, for example, to have practically the same position in these years, stressing the necessity to be united towards Russia, but also to push for a dialogue and involvement. So if there is a more open attitude towards Russia, I'm not worried. I'm happy, because who was contesting our position when we said we need a dialogue? Exactly the right-wing American Republicans. So where I'm not worried about an alliance of the non-democratic and authoritarian. A transatlantic authoritarian alliance is not in the agenda from my point of view. If it was, we would be strongly against, obviously, but I don't see it on the agenda.
Let's go and go back to the study of Körber-Stiftung we briefly mentioned at the beginning. There are some very surprisingly uplifting results as well. 41% of Germans want more responsibility in the world, wants Germany to get more involved in international crisis. So, Mr. Steinmeier, could be a quite strong mandate for a policy, and how are you planning to use that mandate?
Well, I think right at the start, there must always be a statement, because people ask about responsibility, and it's absolutely appropriate, but responsibility doesn't come out of the blue, and that's nothing you wish to have just for political reasons. When we talk about the changes in the world, and we have tried to do that on our panel, given the changes we see in the world, we have more responsibility, especially for some countries like Germany. Germany, and I've always said that publicly, Germany is a country in the middle of Europe where we have political and economic stability, and it goes without saying that we have to assume our responsibility. This is not the first study, not the first survey. These surveys have been conducted over a couple of years, and some years ago the numbers of responses were very low when it came to Germany's commitment abroad. Amazingly, this has changed, at least slightly. And here I would say, as a foreign policy maker, we see an improvement here in public opinion in Germany. Although we have increased our military and political commitments abroad, we see more support for that. In the old days, people would have seen that as a risk. But at the moment, we see a slight tendency for more support, although we cannot show that we are successful everywhere where we are involved. But I think people's support depends on the fact that they understand that it takes time to change foreign policy, that you need stamina, and in order to improve the situation, or at least in order to keep the situation as is. This is not always a story you can talk about with pride, and it's not always easy to sell that to the media. But I do think that people understand that taking care of a conflict is a worthwhile endeavor. At least keeping them under control, that is a value in itself, as people understand. And this is why I think we see this slight increase in the support for a German commitment abroad, for Germany's increased responsibility.
As well, we have 5 minutes just left before. Maybe as I'm getting rid of all my questions, maybe there are questions concerning one of the, beside the transatlantic view, still remaining one of our most crucial question is refugee crisis. We were talking about Libya recently. Might be some questions about Turkey. Maybe we could just widen it and get some questions from the floor. I saw one hand rising there of that lady in red first. And if possible, as we have just 5 minutes, please kindly be short.
Hello, Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Thank you very much for your excellent discussion. If transatlantic relations do erode, doesn't that give China more room to have a role in this region? We saw this with the EU statement on the South China Sea, which was very weak because of China's investments in Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Who wants to answer? Maybe Mr. Steinmeier. Could you first go ahead?
Dazu passt ganz gut, dass wir gerade
This week, we had a German-Chinese economic summit in Hamburg, and we had opportunity there to talk about the changes after the American election. We could discuss that with the Chinese side, and I can just tell you, based on my personal experience, the Chinese are not enthusiastic about those changes. They don't say that there's a lot of room for Chinese power claims going beyond the East Asian region. If I interpreted everything correctly during the talks that we had in Hamburg, the Chinese side is rather concerned that the conflict situation between the US and China could aggravate, and China is not interested in such an aggravation. And so I hope very much that the American-Chinese relationship will stay stable and will not just be seen from the perspective of trade partnerships. Hopefully people will understand that it is crucial, is a crucial political relationship.
Yeah, you got the second question, please.
Thank you. In history, as in earthquakes, we know that there are years which rate very high on the Richter scale. 1989 was such a year, 2001 is such a year. If you were to rate 2016 on the Richter scale, and if 1989, let's say, was a 9, what is 2016? And if it is very high on the Richter scale, do you think that the solutions which have been outlined at this podium are in keeping with the scale of the earthquake?
Maybe we play that for both of you to rank that scale.
If the question is if we have a clear receipt for the global disorder, the answer is no. I think it will be not serious for politicians and governments to say that there are now clear receipts. What we have, and I think that Italy and Germany are really on the same page on this, is values and a method. The values are our values that we are not renouncing to, and the method is the method of multilateralism and bridging agreements. For example, in the Mediterranean, it's absolutely crucial to use this kind of method. Someone calls it the Helsinki method. It has nothing to do with the Helsinki conference, but the Helsinki method means to try to build confidence measures, mutual recognizing among states, decreasing of conflicts, and this is where a strong foreign policy of Europe and of some relevant European member states is very, very needed.
For that scale question from 1 to 10, would you maybe just add?
Nein, ich kann auf diese...
Well, I cannot answer this question like that. I can just quote the Minister of Foreign Affairs of India, who said, you never put a full stop at the end of a sentence as politics. You just always put a comma. We say there is no end of history. And that is why I would warn everyone to describe 2016 as the worst possible scenario we can have in the world. We shouldn't forget that in 2016, we have made progress in some areas. Like, for instance, we were getting very close to a solution of the Cyprus issue. Maybe we can succeed resolving the things we could not resolve in Cyprus over the last 10, 15 years. Paolo Gentiloni said that the seemingly futile fight against Daesh can be won. This will not make terrorism disappear, but Daesh, as a permanent danger, might disappear after winning in Mosul. Next to that, we have many other conflict situations. But let me warn you, do not see that as the end of history, and therefore 2016 should not be given mark 10 on the Richter scale.
As it's now time is running out, and Minister Steinmeier has to fly out to Minsk. Thank you very much. I mean, all the other issues and questions will be discussed in the other panels. Thank you very much, Mr. Gentiloni. Thank you very much, Mr. Steinmeier. And I mean, so many questions, and the crisis as a new normal of policy, we can't go deeper than that. But thanks for your answers.